here. All right, so I want to welcome everybody here to the third session of 5 challenges facing the church in the Western world. Most of you should begin to have starting to receive your books, and let me know in the next week or two if you haven't received that. You can email me at the Keller Center at tgc.org. Yeah, nice job, Christian. So, and then again, like previous weeks, Keller Center at tgc.org. Let me put that in the chat so I don't mess that up. There's the email. All right, so yeah, just like the previous 2 weeks, we're going to kind of go straight through the content. DM me your questions. That's MC-Michael Graham. You can send me a direct message that way, and I'll compile those and we'll go through those there during the Q&A session. And then, as always, I'll be sending recap emails hopefully tomorrow. It is spring break here, so it's a bit of a moving target with my 2 little kids who are in school this week. But if you are not receiving those recap emails, go ahead and also send me a direct message with your preferred email of choice, and I'll make sure to get that in my spreadsheet so that you get those recap emails that have links to where you can either stream or download this session and all the previous sessions. And then that's it in terms of announcements. So I'm going to go ahead and hand the floor over to Trevin here, and Trevin can choose whether he wants to answer my icebreaker question or not. With that, I'm going to mute myself.
Yeah,
and it's good to see everybody.
Yeah, his icebreaker question, great heroes of the faith. I mean, I think I immediately think of like family members first, people that like have really ministered to me or have taught me by showing me what following Jesus looks like. But I definitely have like theological heroes because I'm a little bit of a theology nerd. So probably Augustine is one of my all-time favorites, most important people. I read Confessions. It's the first book I read every year, usually a different translation every year. So I'd probably start there. But like more recently, John Stott would certainly be a hero. His global impact and influence and just the way he handled issues carefully with conviction, but civility and whatnot. So yeah. You may notice the backdrop is a little bit different tonight. We have had we have some people in our neighborhood doing some kind of yard work or something, and around 10:45 this morning, our Wi-Fi went out, and because everybody is using their hotspots, the connection to internet all day has been really spotty. So I headed across town to my parents' house. They happen to be out of town on a marriage retreat, teaching at a marriage retreat this week. So that's why I'm in a little bit of a different location, but hopefully we won't have any issues here. But if we're ready to go, we're going to jump in. We've got a lot of material to cover tonight, and hopefully we'll get to some good discussion. I'm going to start off with, because like last week, you guys know I'm a C.S. Lewis fan. I want to start off with the last written work that C.S. Lewis delivered before he died in 1963. It was an opinion piece for the Saturday Evening Post, and it was called "We Have No Right to Happiness." This is a picture of Lewis at the kilns not long before he died. But just a week before his death, he was actually making final edits to the proof of this article before it was submitted to publication. It is a brief essay. It's not one of his most well-known, but it's extraordinarily prescient. Lewis lays out the problem of separating happiness from obedience to the eternal law. And he shows a lot of foresight in seeing how this right to sexual happiness was going to alter humanity's view of happiness in general until, in his mind, the nature of civilization would be threatened. Okay, so the stakes are really high. But the essay starts with a line of conversation. He says, after all, they had a right to happiness. So that line comes in the context of a man who divorced his wife because he was in love with another man's wife. And that woman was very much in love with the man who she was having the affair with. So she divorced her husband as well. And so you say, well, what about these original spouses, right? The man being left behind had been injured in the war. He had lost his job. The woman being left behind could no longer, maybe she wasn't, as physically attractive as she once had been or whatever, but it came as a shock to everybody involved when the woman who was left by her husband committed suicide. And in response, the man said, but what could I do? A man has a right to happiness. Now, in contemplating that statement, C.S. Lewis recognized that it's connected to the American Declaration of Independence, right? A right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But that idea of pursuing happiness in the mind of the founders, at least, was not unqualified. It didn't mean that a man could pursue happiness by any and every means. Lewis says, like murder, rape, robbery, treason, fraud. No. The original meaning of that phrase meant to pursue happiness by all lawful means. And Lewis is saying not just the laws that you pass in society, but lawful means we're talking about the law of nature. So the right to happiness is not unlimited. It's part of an ordered liberty. It's the pursuit of happiness that is constrained by human nature, by natural law. So it doesn't sanction the following of whatever impulse you have toward whatever actions that might promise happiness but lead to destruction. This is something Lewis says in Mere Christianity. He says, the most dangerous thing you can do is to take any one impulse of your own nature and set it up as the thing you ought to follow at all costs. There is not one of them, the impulses he's talking about, which will not make us into devils if we set it up as an absolute guide. Now, it's been nearly 60 years since Lewis wrote that last essay. And I think that that idea of pursuing happiness apart from the law of nature, I mean, if it was beginning then, it is massive now. It's grown in cultural power. In fact, I would say that the idea of a right to happiness, whatever kind of happiness or however you define it to be, that's just become plain common sense for most people. To the point that we have seen what really, I don't think it's an understatement to say it's a revolution in morality over the past century. And so that leads us to our third major challenge and what's going to be the focus of our time tonight. So challenge number 3 is this. We live in a world infused with Christian sensibilities, now turned against traditional Christian teaching. Okay? So that's the challenge. We live in this world infused with Christian sensibilities, but it's now turned against traditional Christian teaching. And there's been several books recently that demonstrate how Western society is pervasively Christian in like our most deep-rooted assumptions. So a lot of the aspects and the beliefs that just seem like common sense today, like, for example, like, well, everyone knows humans have equal worth and dignity. Okay, that's the result of centuries of Christian influence. Like, you don't get there apart from Christianity. Some of you may have heard of this book, probably the most important one in this regard. It's Tom Holland's book, Dominion. I really like the American cover of this book, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. Tom Holland, we're not talking about the actor who plays Spider-Man, just in case you were wondering if he has like this dual life of being like this amazing historian and actor. We're talking about Tom Holland, the award-winning historian of the ancient world, a British guy. In this book, he recognizes the enormous good brought about by the church through the ages, even though he would recognize the church has often failed to live up to its ideals. And I mean, that's just the nature of the Christian story. It's paradoxical in that way. If you're looking for another book recommendation, Australian church leader John Dickson has a book called Bullies and Saints, and it's a description of key Christian leaders. And what's interesting is the reason that book is called Bullies and Saints is because it's not hard to find both good and bad characters in church history. It's also not hard to find good and bad elements intertwined in the same person that you're studying in church history. Sometimes the saint could also be a bully. So anyway, but back to Holland's book. Holland's point is that the central values and the central priorities of Western culture, they've come from Christianity. Yeah, religious adherence is on the decline among the population. That's right. Nations are secularizing, many of them. That's true. But he would say, even if that's the case, still our priorities, our values come from Christianity. And he even goes one step further. What makes Holland's argument so interesting is that he says Christianity's influence is so pervasive and so powerful that society, without knowing it, borrows from Christian teaching, even appeals to Christian teaching when it condemns the church for its failures. So that's what's most fascinating. So even though Tom Holland doesn't profess faith, as far as I know, he's certainly not an apologist for the church. He seems astonished at the impact of Jesus Christ. That's as he's doing his work as an ancient historian. Here's a striking section near the end of the book. You guys got to see this. He says, "To be a Christian is to believe that God became man and suffered a death as terrible as any mortal has ever suffered. This is why the cross, that ancient implement of torture, remains what it has always been, the fitting symbol of the Christian revolution. It is the audacity of it, the audacity of finding in a twisted and defeated corpse the glory of the creator of the universe, that serves to explain more surely than anything else the sheer strangeness of Christianity and of the civilization and of the civilization to which it gave birth. Today, the power of this strangeness remains as alive as it has ever been. It is manifest in the great surge of conversions that has swept Africa and Asia over the past century, in the conviction of millions upon millions that the breath of the Spirit, like a living fire, still blows upon the world. And in Europe and North America, in the assumptions of many more millions who would never think to describe themselves as Christian. All are heirs to the same revolution, a revolution that has at its molten heart the image of a God dead on a cross." So that's Tom Holland, Dominion, making this case about Christian sensibilities turning against Christian morality. Another example of someone making a case kind of like this is Vishal Mangalwadi. It's called The Book That Made Your World. So this is an Indian scholar, well-versed in Eastern thought and cultures. And he makes the case, I think, persuasively, that the Bible has been the single most powerful force in the emergence of Western civilization. And he points out that criticism of the church or hostility toward the Bible are, strangely, they're motivated by the very values that have been drawn from the Bible. So, quick quote from him. He says, "Today, many people reject the Bible because they consider it to be irrational and irrelevant. Others believe it to be responsible for racial prejudices, sectarian bigotries, slavery, the oppression of women, the persecution of witches, opposition to science, the destruction of the environment, discrimination against homosexuals, and religious wars. However, this criticism itself reveals the powerful influence the Bible had during the last millennium. During that time, hardly any intellectual position or social practice could become mainstream in Christendom unless it could be defended on biblical grounds, real or mistaken. Nor could beliefs and practices be challenged unless their opponents demonstrated that their call for reform was biblical." So this is the key takeaway for him. Criticisms of the Bible are recognition of its unique cultural power. Okay, so that's Vishal Mangalwadi. And then here's one more example of someone making this case, Glenn Scrivener, a minister and evangelist in Eastbourne. He's got this book called The Air We Breathe, How We All Came to Believe in Freedom, Kindness, Progress, and Equality. And he points to 7 values central to the modern outlook that come to us from the influence of Christianity. So here are the 7 values. He says, first of all, equality, that we believe in the equal moral status of every member of the human family. Compassion, we believe a society should be judged by the way it treats its weakest members. Consent, we believe that the powerful have no right to force themselves on others. Enlightenment, we believe in education for all. Science, we believe in its ability to help us understand the world and improve our lives. Freedom, we believe that persons are not property, that we should be in control of our own lives. Progress, we believe in moral improvement over time, and we should continue to reform society of its former evils. Okay, so you see those 7 values. Those values resonate with our culture today, in our society, in Western societies. And what Scrivener does in this book is that his whole purpose is to demonstrate that these values that we believe to be important and that we think are universal, like they're just common sense for everybody, they actually come from the biblical influence on Western cultures. These values are not common sense everywhere. They have not always been common sense for people. They are primarily in societies where Christian influence has been most prominent. So the question then comes, well, what happens when we seek to retain a civilization with these kinds of values, but we cut ourselves off from the sacred origin that they come from? Like, that's a good question we should ask. Another author I would put before you, best-selling author Yuval Noah Harari, in this widely acclaimed book, *Sapiens*, he says the idea of human rights is a useful fiction. So human rights, as much as it may be a value in Western society, that everyone has equal rights or whatnot, he says it's a fiction. This is what he says. He says, there are no gods in the universe, no nations, no money, no human rights, no laws, and no justice outside the common imagination of human beings. So get this. So for Harari in this book, *Sapiens*, created equal, that just means evolved differently. Okay. No one has rights, not really. And there are no universal or eternal principles of justice. And this is what he says: the only place where such universal principles exist is in the fertile imagination of sapiens, of human beings, and in the myths they invent and tell one another. So basically, Harari and other naturalistic authors like him, they would say, yeah, we appreciate the benefits of a society where most people imagine the existence of human rights. Like, that makes for a better world. They're certainly not wanting everyone who reads their book to abandon the framework of human equality and respect. But even as if those are useful, what they're saying is, yeah, but still, at the end of the day, human rights are fictional. Like, we need a critical mass of people to believe these things are sacred, maybe, so that they don't reject them. But I mean, we all kind of know, at least us intellectual types, that they're not really grounded in anything, because there's nothing beyond this present world. But this raises the question, can we really pursue these kinds of values if can we pursue these values as if they are universal if they don't come from God? Os Guinness, some of you may have heard of Oz, cultural thinker, apologist. He says the situation that we are in the West is a cut flower civilization. That means that we're trying to retain and enjoy the life of a flower bloom, when its source of soil, its nutrients, its water, it's all been severed. Or to put it another way, we want the benefits of the kingdom, but we don't want the king. So this is what Guinness says. He says, today we are living in the twilight of the Western world, when, as in previous declining cultures, it is fashionable for the sophisticated and the couth to turn against the old faith that once inspired and empowered the former greatness. Ours is therefore an ABC moment, anything but Christianity, he says. The Christian contributions were curses, not gifts, we are told. They are what is wrong with the world. Now, Guinness says, there was certainly much to confess in Western history, and I am arguing for the Christian faith and not for the West itself, but it is no casual matter for any generation to sever the roots of its culture. For nothing is more certain than the fact that cut flower civilizations cannot and will not last. So you say, well, what are the signs that we're in part of a cut flower civilization? Well, going back to Glenn Scrivener, that book I showed you earlier, and those 7 values, he gives us a few examples of what happens when we insist on the universality of the 7 values, but we don't refer to the Bible. We don't have any understanding of the gospel that inspired those. So for example, the first value that he had, equality. Okay, well, equality, when you sever it from the Christian story, becomes a radical individualism. Now, it's true in more like traditional societies, sometimes they risk losing the individual for the sake of the collective. But in most modern Western societies, the opposite danger is the bigger one, that we see ourselves in atomistic ways, in overly individualistic ways. So that's equality. Compassion. What happens when you sever compassion from the Christian story, where that concern for the weak and the vulnerable is divorced from Christianity? Well, what happens is it turns into what sociologists are now calling competitive victimhood. Okay, so the adoption of victim status is the way that you gain an advantage, or the way you gain power. So, I mean, in other words, if you don't have this robust understanding of the meaning of community and the meaning of personhood and what our bodily realities mean and stuff like that, all we are left with are opposing claims about who is oppressed. And there's no way of determining what victim groups should receive the most attention, okay, or why. So that's what happens. Okay, so another one of those values, consent. What happens with consent? It's a Christian value. When you sever it from the Christian story, then it reduces the meaning of sexuality because it separates it from other values like commitment. So consent is vital, Scrivener says, but it's not a sufficient foundation for sexual ethics. And as soon as we talk about sexual ethics in just a few minutes, we're going to come back to that point because that is a super important point for our cultural moment. But anyway, my point with this is that these Christian values, when you sever them from the Christian story, what happens is they begin to cause as many problems as they solve. So you take these good things, these gifts, these virtues of Christianity, and once you isolate them and you separate them from each other, and especially from the story that gives them meaning and significance, well, it's like the virtues are like fireworks. They shoot off in all sorts of directions and they lead to civilizational conflict and they lead to chaos. This is what G.K. Chesterton said a century ago. He said, "The modern world is not evil. In some ways, the modern world is far too good. It is full of wild and wasted virtues." So get what he said. When a religious scheme is shattered, it is not merely the vices that are let loose. The vices are indeed let loose and they wander and do damage, but the virtues are let loose also. And the virtues wander more wildly, and the virtues do more terrible damage. The modern world, and this is him writing more than a century ago, the modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they have been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. So that's the root of this moral revolution that we're looking at today. And you guys remember from 2 weeks ago, we first talked about expressive individualism and that look-in approach to life. We'll see once that spreads and once that becomes the dominant view, and once you start applying that look-in approach to life to questions of morality, well, then Christian teachings are not seen as just old-fashioned or just problematic or even just wrong. They actually begin to be seen as extreme and dangerous. That's what I mean by a moral revolution. Just look at some of these statistics from a study from Dave Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons. These are the attitudes in the United States from like 7 or 8 years ago. And I would assume that the numbers have shifted even more against traditional Christian teaching since then. And I would guess that if some of you are in the United Kingdom or in Australia, no, we had someone from Australia in the first week, the percentage of opposition would be even stronger. But just take a look at some of the stats. So 2 out of 5 adults say it's extremist to try to convert someone else to your faith. 69% of all Americans and 83% of atheists and agnostics believe evangelism is extremist. Slim majority says that holding the belief that same-sex relationships are morally wrong is extremist. 2 out of 5 adults believe it's extreme to quit a good-paying job to pursue mission work in another country. So, you'd think, especially with that last one, okay, like the idea that that would be something that maybe previous generations would have maybe not all done themselves, but would have at least appreciated, or you would have gotten some kind of cultural credit for that. Not anymore. So what's happening here? Well, you take Christian values and virtues, separate them from the Christian story, and you create this situation in which the assumptions formed by Christianity now become weaponized against the doctrines proclaimed by Christianity. So this new moral code with deeply Christian assumptions, but divorced from anything other than the desire for self-fulfillment, that steadily replaces the moral code that once held sway in society. So Gabe Lyons and Dave Kinnaman, they sum up their research. They say, based on their studies, there are 6 core moral values in American society, and they call it the morality of self-fulfillment. Here they are. The first one is to find yourself, look within yourself. Basically, that's why we lead off with week 1. And I think it's like 91% of Americans agree with that statement. So that's like the foundation for all the rest. Number 2, people should not criticize someone else's life choices, right? So like I said in week 1, if the greatest commandment is to find and be yourself, then the second commandment is affirm whatever self your neighbor decides to be true to. Okay. Don't criticize your neighbor's life choices. Number 3, to be fulfilled in life, pursue the things you desire most. So kind of a hedonism or a therapeutic understanding of life, which leads to 4, enjoying yourself is the highest goal of life. 5, people can believe whatever they want as long as those beliefs don't affect society. Like that's where things get controversial. And then number 6, this is the sexual component of this. Any kind of sexual expression between 2 consenting adults is fine. Now, we're going to look at the consent question in a minute, but interestingly though, digging into point 6 on that list, this is what happens when the assumptions of expressive individualism, everything we talked about 2 weeks ago, gets applied to sexuality. The new moral framework is rooted in that individualistic outlook. You really can't separate the weeks. And you really can't, even from last week, when we talk about a personalized religion that doesn't have public implications, like you can't separate these things. That's why the order of these weeks has been this way. Tara Isabella Burton lays out, once again, this focus on authenticity and freedom and how it influences our view of morality. So this is what she says is true of many people in our society. Our purpose at a very deep and real level is to express our authentic selves and to pursue that self through freedom. We are totally free beings, beholden to nobody but ourselves. Exerting that freedom, furthermore, is at the core of what it means to pursue the good. Our choices in this model both define and liberate us. When we choose to reject existing outlines and predetermined scripts about what our life should be like, allowing personal and particular negotiation to take the place of extrinsic moral authority in our lives, we are achieving something close to our purpose. So get that. When we choose to reject existing outlines and predetermined scripts, basically the kind of moral code that you would get from scripture or from your religion or whatever, you're actually achieving your purpose when you go against that. So not surprisingly, this is why the church has seen conflicts arise over sexuality in recent years. Because for many people, the purpose of life is to push against extrinsic moral authority. The purpose of life is to resist cultural constraints, to overcome cultural constraints that will keep you from being true to yourself. You link up sexuality with identity, and then the conflict even becomes more clear. Like the church in its traditional teaching is standing in the way of individual authenticity and freedom as expressed sexually. So I think C.S. Lewis was prophetic in how he saw, this was 60 years ago this year, how he saw that the right to happiness was already in his day being applied to sexual happiness. So going back to the conversation about divorce and suicide and the comment about having a right to happiness, Lewis says back in that essay, he says, it's odd that his female friend who said, they had a right to happiness, he says, well, she would have been scandalized if anyone had defended the actions of a ruthless man-eating tycoon on the ground that his happiness consisted in making money and he was pursuing his happiness. She was also a rabid teetotaler. He said, and he says, I never heard her excuse an alcoholic because he was happy when he was drunk, right? So Lewis recognized really when the lady said, well, they had a right to happiness, that already meant in 1963, sexual happiness. And he also noted the irony when people were like, well, we should just treat sex like any other impulse. He said, no, actually, why do they say that? Because they actually intend to treat sex, he says, as no other impulse in our nature has ever been treated by civilized people. This is what he says in the essay. He says, all the other impulses have to be bridled. Absolute obedience to your instinct for self-preservation is what we call cowardice. To your acquisitive impulse, avarice. Even sleep must be resisted if you're a sentry. But every unkindness and breach of faith seems to be condoned, provided that the object aimed at is 4 bare legs in a bed. So that's Lewis echoing something that Chesterton noted even several decades before. Chesterton said the same thing. You can't treat sex just like any other impulse, because when you do, the fire escapes the fireplace and burns down the house. This is what Chesterton said. He said, thus the effect of treating sex as only one innocent natural thing was that every other innocent natural thing became soaked and sodden with sex. this is so prophetic for our current cultural moment. Like, I mean, if it seems like everything has become overly sexualized, this is the reason why. He said, sex cannot be admitted to a mere equality among elementary emotions or experiences like eating and sleeping. The moment sex ceases to be a servant, it becomes a tyrant. So, excusing the man who deserts his wife so he can find sexual happiness in someone else, Lewis says, what you're actually doing is you're giving a preposterous privilege to the sexual impulse. I mean, that's an offense against good faith to, to solemn promises and marriage. It's against gratitude and common humanity. And Lewis says it would lead us to condone all sorts of behavior, he says, which if it had in any other end in view would be condemned as merciless, treacherous, and unjust. And so what Lewis foresaw was that this unfettered right to happiness, meaning sexual happiness, that disregarded the constraints of the natural law, like that was going to lead to a future that could threaten civilization. And I think that's where we are. Os Guinness and other historians have pointed out, we live in a cut flower civilization. So infused over centuries with Christian values like equality and consent, and now divorced from the moral vision that even sustained and promoted those values. I'll give you one example of this quickly. Glenn Scrivener points to the very strange, ironic, almost shocking case in 2019. There was a British court who ruled against a doctor who claimed that his opposition to transgender ideology was rooted in Genesis 1:27. You know, Genesis 1:27 is where it says God created mankind in his own image, male and female, right? The judge said that the doctor's belief in Genesis 1:27 was, quote, incompatible with human dignity. Now, what's so astonishing about that claim is that it's the teaching of Genesis 1:27 about us being made in God's image that's the foundation for human dignity and equality in the first place. So this is what Glenn says. He says, so the verse that lies at the root of human dignity was condemned in a judgment that very much calls to mind the image of a culture sawing at the branch of the tree on which it is perched. So that puts us in a peculiar predicament. The challenge is that of a post-Christian society in which the values of Christianity have been divorced from the story and then turned against the specifics of Christian teaching. So I'd say that's quite a time to be a follower of Jesus. We've not quite, people say, oh, it's just like the pre-Christian world. That's what we're going back to. Well, in some ways, yes, but in some ways, no. We've never actually been here in a culture that is infused with Christian sensibilities turned against Christianity. So what opportunities do we have in this kind of world? We see the challenge. I hope you all feel the challenge we're talking about. What's the opportunity? Well, here's the way I would say it. We join the long line of saints who thrive at the margins as a creative and prophetic minority. Remember in week 1, we talked about how the church always faces opposition. It's always in crisis, always stable. The gospel, always under assault, always advancing. There may be rise and decline. You may even see the death and resurrection of Christian communities in certain parts of the world. But worldwide, we take heart because after all, no matter what's happening here, we can see the Christian faith continuing to spread. It may seem like revival or restoration seems far from a post-Christian context. You may look at the situation and say, wow, those obstacles are really formidable. All true. Tim Keller says there's never been a fast-growing revival in a post-Christian secular society. So that's what Keller says. But then Tim Keller also says, but every great thing is unprecedented until it happens. So just because it hasn't happened before doesn't mean it will happen. It won't happen. So, but my question is, so how do we live under these circumstances? I mean, barring a massive revival, which we should pray for and hope for, how do we live? Well, some people are going to say, well, I think we should accommodate the Christian faith to the world wherever we can. Shift attention from the sharp edges of distinction between the church and the world. Maybe shy away from making a public case for doctrines or morals that seem intolerable to people. Uh, we can always just champion the Bible's emphasis on how we should care for the poor, or the oppressed, or make a difference in regard to the environment, concerns because of climate change, or just basically lift up these aspects of Christian witness that will make us respectable with the people whose favor we want to receive, and maybe avoid the critique of the cultural influencers. That's one approach. But that's not a robust and full Christian witness. It's just not. A holistic Christian witness doesn't let us divide up the Christian view of morality. A holistic Christian witness means we've got to insist on the goodness of our natural bodies, male and female, the full humanity of prenatal children, the biblical vision of sex and marriage. Like you can't divorce, you can't like sever those things from a holistic Christian witness. But if we do that, then I think we're going to become something akin to a creative minority. That's a term that I borrow from Mark Sayers. You could call it a prophetic minority. It's basically an understanding that we are way out of step with society on this, and we're happily so. Here's how Sayers describes the opportunity. He says, creative minorities find themselves withdrawn and distant from what they know and find comfort in. This distance, here's the opportunity with it. This distance enables them to see the myths and blind spots of their own culture, to reject these myths and find a greater dependency in God. And this dependency on a source of power and truth outside of the dominant culture leads creative minorities to refresh and reinvigorate ailing cultures. Do we live in an ailing culture? Yes. Are we on the road to progress toward a moral utopia of equality? Or do we live in a world of disillusionment where people are increasingly dissatisfied with the unfulfilled promises of the moral revolution? There's a great quote from George Orwell back in 1940. He was looking back over his earlier revolutionary tendencies, and he made this striking statement. He said, for 200 years, we had sawed and sawed and sawed at the branch we were sitting on. And in the end, much more suddenly than anyone had foreseen, our efforts were rewarded and down we came. But unfortunately, there had been a little mistake. The thing at the bottom was not a bed of roses after all. It was a cesspool full of barbed wire. It appears that amputation of the soul isn't just a simple surgical job like having your appendix out. The wound has a tendency to go septic. So strangely, here's the good news about all attempts at establishing the kingdom of God, the effects that come from the kingdom of God without referencing the king. The good news is they're all bound to fail. Idols don't deliver on their promise. Human nature, physical reality, the unchanging tendencies of the human heart, these all strike back. Truth is ultimately irrepressible. And so I think we do have an opportunity here to provide a way out of the barbed wire and the septic cesspool at the bottom of all these fanciful visions. And we can point back to the roots where nourishment can be found for flowering and flourishing. I would put it this way. Jesus' statement that his followers are the salt of the earth and the light of the world, that does not have an expiration date. So no matter the obstacles we face, this is our identity, and that's our task, to slow down decay and act as a flavoring and a preservative in the world around us, shining even brighter when the darkness closes in. So you may be thinking, okay, so Trevin, you've shown the challenge and you've said we have this opportunity, but okay, what are the specifics of the opportunities? I think there's a couple here that I want to share with you, because I think that this will kind of set us up for the conversation here in a little bit. How are we going to stand out in this world where this moral revolution is taking place? The first one is the power of forgiveness. The power of forgiveness. Now, you might think that a world without the notion of eternal judgment, a world without moral prohibitions, without ethical constraints, that's going to bring about more freedom, more tolerance, less conflict. No, the opposite is what happens. The world becomes more judgmental, more moralistic, more intolerant when Christianity fades. You say, why is that the case? Because there's no longer an outside solution for feelings of guilt and shame. And there's no longer the cultural expectation or expression of forgiveness. That's the challenge. So Tim Keller wrote in The Fading of Forgiveness, this was an article, he turned it into a book, about the unique opportunity the church has in challenging a vindictive and unforgiving culture. And he points to like the testimony of Barbara Reynolds, who marched in the civil rights protests of the 1960s. She claimed that the movements that were led by Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela, that these were marked by the ethics of love, forgiveness, and reconciliation. And she says that's in contrast to some of the present day movements for justice, which often succumb to a spirit of vengeance and vindictiveness. And Keller says forgiveness has faded because our culture has turned toward expressive individualism. And so again, back to week one, when the individual is all that matters, forgiveness, reconciliation, caring about the well-being of the community, all of that gets the shaft. Like it just gets sidelined. And yeah, and some of you may be saying, yeah, but I mean, I still hear people talking about forgiveness and how we need to forgive ourselves and forgive other people. Yeah, but whenever you hear that, it's always, the purpose is generally therapeutic, right? You need to forgive yourself, or you need to forgive this person who wronged you or whatever. Why? Because that will give you a peaceful inner sense of well-being, right? The reason forgiveness is no longer as popular, or it has faded, is because there's an aspect of self-renunciation there. You give up your right to pay back someone for what they did to you. But our culture just doesn't even have a concept of self-renunciation. We've been conditioned to think that self-assertion, self-fulfillment, that's the way to happiness. Self-sacrifice doesn't really make sense in this kind of world. And so that's why there's been like the rise of cancel culture so quickly. Professor Alan Jacobs has a great book called How to Think, but he talks about why forgiveness has fallen out of favor. And what he says is this: he says, when a society rejects the Christian account of who we are, it doesn't become less moralistic, but far more so, because it retains an inchoate sense of justice, but has no means of offering or receiving forgiveness. The great moral crisis of our time is not, as many of my fellow Christians believe, sexual licentiousness, but rather vindictiveness. Get this quote. Social media, and we're going to get to this in week 5, but just a little preview. Okay. Social media serve as crack for moralists. There's no high like the high you get from punishing malefactors. But like every addiction, this one suffers from the inexorable law of diminishing returns. The mania for punishment will therefore get worse before it gets better. So what's our opportunity? Well, if we see it and push for this, we have the opportunity to be a sign and foretaste of the future world of love and harmony. I mean, forgiveness is the way that we as Christians, in response to broken relationships, we give the world a vision of reconciliation. Tim Keller says, he points to Hannah Arendt, the Jewish political philosopher who wrote after the Holocaust. She said this: she said, without being forgiven, released from the consequences of what we have done, our capacity to act would, as it were, be confined to one single deed from which we could never recover. We would remain the victims of its consequences forever, not unlike the sorcerer's apprentice who lacked the magic formula to break the spell. So Keller says this: he says, the most obvious contribution that the church could make is to recover its own theology and practice of forgiveness and become a true counterculture that can serve as a witness to the world. And I mean, just imagine the church like that, bringing together into the community of faith people who, in worldly ways of thinking anyway, people who would be socially incompatible, but showing how they demonstrate the beauty and power of Christian love. The mutual love of Christians, the practices of forgiveness, they can stand out in a world that is more moralistic and vindictive because it's pursuing earthly justice without a connection to the God who judges and justifies. So that's the first big opportunity: forgiveness in a world of like a radically new moralism. The second one is a new sexual revolution. A new sexual revolution. What's really interesting is that, I mentioned, so I told you when we talked about the new moral code, I told you we'd come back to this question of consent. One of the values that came from Christianity was consent. But when you sever that value from its Christian roots, what happens? Well, what's interesting is I've noticed that there's a growing number of commentators who say we really need to rethink our society's norms surrounding sexuality. And I'm not talking about Christian commentators. They're saying things like, casual sexual encounters, they bring more misery than happiness. They say consent isn't a high enough standard to bring about sexual fulfillment and freedom. So, for example, there's an article from Helen Lewis in The Atlantic. It's called the Problem with Being Cool About Sex. And she says the new generation of feminists hasn't reconciled what we should want with what we do want. Part of that's because of pornography. It has saturated the lives of young people. It has colored an entire generation's expectations of what sex should be. She writes, if two or more adults consent to it, whatever it is, no one else is entitled to an opinion. That's the common sense thinking. The problem, she says, is that the sexual revolution's promises haven't panned out. Okay, so we blew up all these old moral strictures. Well, it didn't bring utopia. In fact, there's confusion now over sex and its purpose and its meaning and its significance. What's fascinating, so she's got her finger like on the problem here. And at the end of the day, she just says, there's no simple answer to this. Maybe we should just adjust our expectations, that the utopia of sexual freedom and fulfillment is just never going to come. And then she concludes her article with this killer line, which this sums up a truth about fallen humanity that could be lifted straight from Augustine, Aquinas, even the Apostle Paul. Here's her quote. We will never simply want the things we should. We will never simply want the things we should. So this is an example of someone non-Christian recognizes all of the problems and confusion, and then also is stumbling around in the dark and also realizing a fundamental insight into the human heart. On a similar note, there's a new book by Christine Emba called Rethinking Sex. And she says young Americans are engaging in sexual encounters that they don't really want for reasons they don't fully agree with. She says, yes, it's depressing. Like Lewis, she recognizes it's, her quote, turbocharged by pornography, which has mainstreamed even more extreme sexual acts. Dating apps that lead people to expect new partners to be readily available. Okay. The outcome of the sexual revolution is, she says, so if consent is the only moral stipulation, don't worry about marriage. Don't even worry about commitment in a relationship, just consent. She says the result is a world in which young people are both liberated and miserable. So this is what she writes. She says, even when it goes well, sex is complicated. It involves our bodies, minds, and emotions, our connections to each other and our deepest selves. Despite the many and popular arguments that it's only a physical act, it is clear to almost anyone who has had it that sex has vast consequences, some of which can last long after an encounter ends. And so she basically says consent isn't enough. What if there are sexual practices that are dehumanizing, that are degrading? Are they ethically valid even if there is consent? She said, so maybe there is a right and wrong when it comes to sexual activity. What would a better sexual ethic look like? So the responses that she discovers as she's kind of doing this comes from words like listening, care, mutual responsibility, love. Get that, love, And that last word she defines by Thomas Aquinas as willing the good of the other. Now, okay, these are just a couple of books. Louise Perry has a new book called In the Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Here's the thing. These comments, these books, they don't go so far as to recommend the Christian ethic that reserves sex for the covenant of the marriage between a man and a woman. But there's something really important happening right now. We're learning something from these complaints about how consent isn't enough and how pornography is destroying things. And this means we have an opportunity. People are not sexually self-satisfied right now. They're actually very confused, very hurt, disappointed that consent is all that matters. Sexual ethic, there are plenty of places in which we have the opportunity to reach out with love and mercy toward our neighbors. This is why, the idea that now would be the time we would get on the bandwagon of the sexual revolution and follow that new moral code, Christians are always behind on stuff like that. Like, okay, let's jump on the bandwagon as people are wanting to get off, the bandwagon, like wanting to not be in this kind of world. So basically, when the sexual revolution's promises are failing all around us, now is the worst time to hitch Christianity to the train. But I would even say this: what's even more is we should remember the first sexual revolution didn't start in the 1960s. It was with the rise of Christianity. Really good book called From Shame to Sin. Historian Kyle Harper. He talks about the potency of early Christianity on sexuality. He says the coordinated assault on the extramarital sexual economy marks one of the more consequential revolutions in the history of sex. So basically, he said, by forbidding all sex beyond the marriage bed, this new sexual ethic, he's talking about the Christian sexual ethic, came to mark the great divide between Christians and the world. So the early church stood out from the rest of society, not just because of what they said was true of God, but because of how they behaved sexually. He says, nowhere did the moral expectations of the Jesus movement stand in such stark contrast to the world in which its adherents moved. Now, I know many denominations in the West have been rocked by controversy over sexuality these days. I don't think that's because, as the media will say, or people will sometimes say, that Christians are just obsessed with other people's sexual activities. I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's because Christians around the world recognize instinctively that the push to change the definition of marriage means much more to the faith than just like you're just expanding marital blessing. No, Christians around the world instinctively recognize that that is a reversion back to a long discarded pagan assumption about the nature of the body and the purpose of sex. I can't overstate this enough. It is the reason we cannot change our view of marriage and sexuality is because in doing so, we would be exchanging one moral cosmology for another. So Christians from non-Western cultures, those who resist, you could call it intellectual colonization, theological colonization from predominantly white Western liberals, they're the ones sounding the alarm here because they recognize there are cosmological ramifications. And what's fascinating about this book on the screen right now from Harper, I mean, he's not even promoting a Christian sexual ethic. He kind of sees some of it as at least neutral or even negative. But he has no trouble when describing early Christian views in using phrases like highly distinctive sexual gospel or radical new orthodoxy of sexual propriety, or saying it's the development of Orthodox Christian sexuality as a moral ideology that set Christians apart from the world. Now, don't hear me saying that everything in the history of the church has been right on sexuality. Like there have been developments of doctrines regarding sexuality in the body. There have been some wrong turns. There have been some overemphases. There have been some ascetic extremes. There have been extra biblical gender roles, culturally driven things. Listen, my point is not to say that our forebears got everything right in every case. But when you talk about the effect and the seriousness of the early church's witness regarding sexuality, you can't even imagine a scenario in which the earliest Christians would say, oh, on marriage and sexuality, we can just agree to disagree. No. On this point, brothers and sisters from the global South stand with the church throughout the ages, and revisionist theologies from the West show how radically out of step they are with the world of the Bible and the church. One last aspect of our opportunity is that we have the opportunity to provide a countercultural witness as a creative minority, a countercultural witness, to be radically distinct here. One of my favorite lines from C.S. Lewis comes from his novel Till We Have Faces. It says, "Die before you die. There is no chance after." It's a call to death, to the killing of sinful lusts, and I love how Lewis describes lusts in The Great Divorce. He says they are really poor, weak, whimpering, whispering things compared with that richness and energy of desire which will arise when lust has been killed. Lewis is sounding the same note as Jesus. Jesus told his disciples to die daily, to pick up the cross and follow him. Lewis wants to make sure that we don't conceive of Christianity apart from that kind of total surrender. I know some of you in here, I know everyone in this room, if you're here for this, you are thoughtful Christians. Some of you are church leaders, pastors, you have influence in your congregation. I want to point out a parallel to Christians 100 years ago. If you were to flash back in time to the 1900s, technology was progressing by leaps and bounds. The age of science and reason had stirred up a sense of optimism in North America. And yeah, it was the Christian view of the world that gave rise to a lot of that scientific inquiry and that cultural environment for discovering truths about the natural world. But what happened 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 100 years ago, was that the scientific experiment got severed from its roots of belief in God and the natural order. And the science itself had begun to be turned against traditional Christian teaching in favor of naturalism, like a philosophical naturalism, a philosophical materialism. So, okay, let's say you dropped in on a meeting. If they could have done Zoom, then they wouldn't have. It would have to have been an actual physical meeting with a pastor or theologian discussing how the gospel would best spread in the 20th century. And let's say there's someone in there saying, Christianity's in trouble. The Bible is full of supernatural events and miracles. We can't expect people in our scientific age to believe in these stories without question. I mean, come on. The idea of the virgin birth is just astounding to educated people in our time. And you can hear the other pastors saying, so like, what are you saying? You think we should abandon these truths? Christians have always believed these things. And then maybe the theologian says something like, oh, no, I'm not saying we deny miracle stories altogether. But I mean, at least can we downplay them? I mean, why not avoid aspects of the faith that would embarrass educated Christians in our time? So the pastor's thinking, so you think that would help our mission? Theologians say, yeah, because the miracles, that's not the center of Christianity. Like what's truly breathtaking about our faith is it's like how it makes the world a better place. And these moral truths that show God is our Father and all mankind are brothers. And we should just focus on the morality of Christianity, not the miracles. Because otherwise we're causing unnecessary offense and we're hindering our mission. Listen, everybody, that conversation from 100 years ago made sense to a lot of people. I mean, and I'm not questioning motives. They wanted to reach as many people as possible. They wanted to faithfully embody the gospel. It makes sense that some would think the best way forward is that you avoid the unpopular aspects of Christianity. But if I could travel back in time, I would want to interrupt that conversation. And I'd want to say, hey, I'm from the future. Listen, let me tell you, 100 years from now, people will be talking about how the fastest growing movement within Christianity is Pentecostalism, a movement of Christians who emphasize miracles and healings in the present. And let me tell you, the churches that downplayed or denied the supernatural claims of Christianity, they are in massive numerical freefall. Okay. Now I can imagine their surprise. Them saying, wait, you mean the groups that didn't downplay, but actually reveled in the supernatural grew the most? And the groups that downplayed the miracles have nearly disappeared? I'm not a Pentecostal. It's fascinating to me, though, to look at the last 100 years. It is so easy to think that the best way for Christianity to grow is you just emphasize the palatable parts for the culture and you avoid the offensive. But if you look at the last 100 years, the very things that were most embarrassing to a scientific age have, in many cases, become the most attractive elements of Christianity. I think we're in a moment where pastors and theologians are in a similar conversation, except this time miracles aren't under the spotlight. Christian morality is. So you could put it this way. 100 years ago, some said we should focus on morality apart from the miracles. Today, some say we should focus on miracles apart from Christian morality. I mean, that makes sense. I've got single friends in their 30s and 40s who have chosen to live according to Jesus's teaching and pursue chastity. And there are people who think they are strange, backward, repressed. Like their sexual abstinence is seen as harmful by the society that says sexual expression is really the pinnacle of human flourishing. So I get it. Like strategically, wouldn't it make sense to shift the Christian vision of sexuality and marriage? I mean, why focus on these embarrassing aspects of the faith? If you don't deny the historic Christian teaching like the revisionists do, I mean, you could at least downplay them. That's the pragmatic approach. Wouldn't that remove obstacles? I say no. If the lesson from the last century is any indication, ground zero for explosive gospel witness in the next 100 years is going to be the place where we are most likely to run afoul of the cultural authorities. So let's fast forward in time. What if 100 years from now, the Christians who have exploded in growth and passion across the world are the ones that sought to reaffirm and embody the historic Christian teaching on sexuality and family? Or let me ask this. What if we are on the verge of a 21st century of attractive Christian witness because of our morality, not in spite of it? Like, what if the church is going to provide a moral ballast in a society that doesn't have any anchors? It's just adrift in a sea of misery. So, I mean, this is why we have to be known for dissent. Back in the 60s and 70s, it was the sexual rebels were the hippies. They wanted to throw off moral restraints and free love and all that. In the 21st century, we're going to be the sexual rebels, the Christians who dissent from the sexual revolution dogma. But even in dissent, we shouldn't be gloomy about that. We should be the kind of rebels that don't just talk about the lies of the sexual revolution all the time, but that actually answer the longings of why people believe those lies in the first place by having a different vision of sex and marriage together, declaring what God is for, and trusting that 100 years from now, the Christian truth will be as solid as ever, even if the cultural challenges have changed. So C.S. Lewis's final essay, it shows that freedom, that quote unquote freedom that's in a society with a right to happiness, it turns out to be a different form of slavery. But thankfully, the gospel has a fresh word for the weary, for the guilt-ridden, that those that pursue happiness in all the wrong places. Augustine wrote, "Our hearts are restless until they find themselves in you." And that's what Christianity has, is a fresh message for an exhausted generation pursuing happiness. We get to have the good news to say that salvation doesn't come from mustering up your willpower and making your mark on the world, but in recognizing your dependence on God and receiving the mark he made on the world in the person of Jesus Christ. So as difficult as this challenge is, I think it's an exciting time to be alive, to be a follower of Jesus. We can learn to recognize expressive individualism and how it's applied to sexuality, and we can tell the rest of the world, Jesus is better than this. Jesus is better. And that's my prayer, is that God is going to make our mission fruitful as we spread the good news of grace offered to us by a crucified and risen Lord who is coming again to make all things new. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike. We can shift out of the PowerPoint presentation.
All right, first question here is a doozy. I'm going to put it in the chat. Comes from Joel, who's boarding a plane right now. So this is in hopes that he'll actually get a chance to hear this. The biblical prohibitions regarding sexual licentiousness are relatively clear: adultery, pornography, homosexuality, transgenderism, etc. Can you explain to why the biblical message is not just a prohibition, but good news for those who are struggling with those sins, particularly LGBT issues? What does freedom in Christ look like for them? How does the church rightly welcome those who struggle in these ways? Great questions.
No, that's a fantastic question. So first, to take the end part of that question first, how does the church welcome? The church should welcome any and all kinds of sinners into the sanctuary, because the church is both a hospital for sinners and a school for saints, right? So we are united by our need for Christ, and we are also united by our redemption in Christ and our pursuit of holiness. So where the church has failed at this, at recognizing a place, or has just simply written off certain kinds of sinners or certain kinds of struggles against sin, we've done so really against the model of Jesus, who without shame shared the table with all kinds of repentant sinners, even when the churchier folks of his day looked down on that. So I think we have to start there with a radical welcome, and the expectation that if we are actually sharing the gospel with people, we will be we'll have all kinds of people who are in some ways broken, messed up in all kinds of ways, not just sexually, just in all kinds of areas. Sanctification is messy if you're actually reaching sinners. So so that should be the expectation and not a surprise when it comes to welcome. When it comes to how we talk about it as for it being good news, um, this one's really challenging because the world sort of has the corner right now on making our on making one's sexual attractions like the end all be all of one's identity, in a way that it's lifted up to being like the core most recognizable aspect of identity, to where, and because that's married to the expressive individualism of you being you, it makes it means that you expressing yourself sexually is just an extension of you just being yourself and expressing that to the world. That's the purpose of life. And so that is where you're going to find happiness. And that's what's going to be good news. Because again, the challenge with the, people in the LGBT community is not just the challenge on the surface of sex and identity being married together. It's the underlying expressive individualist assumptions underneath that where the challenge is. So this is where it gets tricky for the church, because if we're not careful, we will take the moral prohibitions of the Bible and tell people that are same-sex attracted, this is what dying to yourself looks like for you, and you must, because the Bible says this, while we basically excuse or even applaud expressive individualism in all sorts of ways with Christians who are not that kind of sinner, so to speak. Does that make sense? Like the one of the areas where we struggle here is that I think that there's a good point made when we basically treat we basically are okay with expressive individualism, you be you, be true to yourself no matter what, whatever, and even kind of wink and nod at expressive individualism expressed sexually in ways that are not same-sex attracted. And then when we get to same-sex attraction, it's like then we draw a line. The point isn't to move the line so that we include for inclusion and things like that, so that we include LGBT people without any kind of turning from sin or in repentance. The solution is to move the line much further back so that everybody recognizes that the call to die daily is that's the Christian life for everybody. And we shouldn't be treating same-sex attraction like it's a completely different sin from all of the other ones we're called to die to. So that's otherwise we're giving it the preposterous privilege that Lewis is talking about when he talks about sexual happiness. So we got to move the line way back this way. And I think, Joel, I think one of the ways that we are going to, hopefully in the next couple of decades, be able to help this be good news is, I think, in our increasing sort of gender insanity that's happening across the country, by being rooted in the body, like what the embodied nature is, like what it means for us to be male and female, made in God's image in embodied ways, and there being a meaning to our bodies. That's going to be more attractive, not less, in the years to come. I think we have to sound this, even if it's not attractive to the world. And right now, I don't think it certainly is. But I think the day is going to come where without that anchor, things are going to get crazier and crazier until reality bites back. So when the church finally is saying what the world will eventually be hungry again for, which is a return to like something more anchoring for the identity of people than sort of fleeting feelings about, or even persistent feelings about what it is that makes me me. The goodness and the meaning of our human bodies is going to be an answer to that. We are more than our attractions. We are more than our feelings. We are actually embodied people. And that has significance and meaning. And right now, in an expressive individualist society, for a lot of people, that strikes people as constraining, which is why in the transgender debates, people want to be free from their body, or they want to alter the body, right? Because they feel like the body is a constraint. Where we'll eventually, this is going to come back around, and when it does, the church has got to be able to have to have really good news about what it means for us to be embodied people, and knowing that this is part of why we confess God the Father, maker of heaven and earth, everything visible and invisible. Why we also confess our belief in the resurrection of the body. Like, this goes to the very core of what it means to be Christian. But great question.
All right, next question. What would you tell pastors and ministry leaders whose churches consist of people suspicious of anything countercultural, that is, outside of, say, evangelical talking points? For example, immediately accused of being liberal for suggesting we befriend people who are gay, transgender, abused, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we are like Jesus if we are castigated as being the friend of sinners. So, like, I mean, that's what Jesus was known for, and that's why some people thought he was, unsound or whatever. Even though this is the Messiah we're talking about. Even Paul, I think I go back to the scripture in Paul where he talks about separating from people inside the community who are refusing to repent and who are determined to remain in sexual immorality. But that Paul is saying, but I wouldn't say to do that from people outside the world, like that in the world, like that's like Paul was expecting the church to be reaching out to people in the world that were in, following pagan customs and things like that. It was the people in the church that he was saying, you've got to have a sharp line of distinction. So yeah, I guess if someone's saying, hey, you're being too countercultural, or you're being too, I guess the question isn't countercultural. It's more like you're being too worldly. I would ask the question, what makes you, I would ask the question back and to say, what is it about my approach that makes you think I'm being worldly? The fact that I'm friendly with someone, the fact that I'm seeking a relationship, the fact that I'm, seeking to share truth through relationship. Do you see me as compromising my beliefs or my convictions in some way because I have befriended, or because I'm, I think those are the questions. And then you might get into specifics. There may be someone saying, well, I think you may be seeing in this signal or that signal. And I think we should watch for that. Like, I do think there could be places where in our desire to befriend and to welcome, we could perhaps send the wrong signals as to what it is we believe or whatnot. But if Jesus says to love your neighbor, and he even says to love your enemies, I mean, surely that means people that think differently than we do when it comes to sexuality, gender, marriage, things like that. And I mean, what does love look like if not at some level, the pursuit of relationship and showing grace across those divides?
All right, supposing the time is here, but will come with greater awareness that the moral revolution has many profound gaps, problems, and causes a lot of felt anxiety and depression. How do believers stay alert, compassionate, and ready to forgive and love who have opposed them? Beyond prayer, what values and priorities are essential to believers collectively moving forward? What needs to be preserved at all costs? I suppose this is a question about equipping. What do we need to practice from the youngest to the oldest among us?
Yeah, I'm not optimistic that there's going to be like a wide scale turn to like Christian values anytime soon. I think we're going to be a prophetic and creative minority, at least for the rest of my life. And I'm hoping to live 50 more years if the Lord gives me that much time. So, I just think we'll be in the minority. I do think though that creative and prophetic minority will be more attractive to more people than we think is the point I'm making there. And so, yes, there will be people who right now oppose us very vociferously that are then kind of coming or may come around at some level. Um, if that's the case, I think, I mean, we're the kind of people we should be the kind of people that we welcome converts all the time. And look, there may even be people who should know, and I wrote about this a couple of years ago or a few years ago. We need to provide a way back for people that have whiffed on this in the church, and who may have gone down the path of thinking that being affirming and inclusive or whatever is the way to go out of compassion, but who are second guessing that now because they see where things are going way farther than they anticipated and are less and less comfortable with it. Like I saw, it wasn't that long ago that there was, well, I write about this in Thrill of Orthodoxy, like, there's a an ethicist who basically decided it was time to take this bold leap into the future and to change our view on marriage and sexuality, and to say that gay marriage was fine, and then found that when he pushed back against some on the progressive side against polyamory, saying there's nothing in the Bible that sanctions polyamory, like that's off limits, relationships between 3 and 4 and more and whatnot. The pushback was such to the point, like suddenly he realized, oh, no one really cares that the Bible doesn't, like, all the people were so justifying polyamory, they weren't even listening to him as an ethicist who had like taken this big bold leap. And so I basically said he thought he was taking a big bold step in the future of Christianity, and he realized he was on an escalator that was going rapidly down. It was a descending escalator. So what happens if that guy, I don't think it's going to happen with him, but let's say someone like that, they start to rethink and they may want to actually come back toward orthodoxy. I think the thing we should absolutely do is pull people back in, because there are going to be people that get led astray by this, even in our churches and whatnot. There may be people that leave our churches this year because they don't think we're welcoming and affirming enough to LGBT people or whatever, but who might wind up in 3 or 4 years gravitating back because they realize there's actually no Bible where they went. There's no gospel being presented. And then suddenly start to rethink, well, maybe I have been wrong on this, and that there is a way to still be loving and welcoming and not revisionist in theology. So I think we've got to be convictional and kind. And when people change their minds, as some will, we need to see them, we need to bring them back in. And then people that don't change their minds necessarily at the outset, but are just refugees from the sexual revolution, they're just part of the carnage of the sexual revolution. We've got to be the place that like helps bind up those wounds. There can be no smell of "I told you so" to people that have been hurt and harmed by the sexual revolution. I mean, we know that as parents, like we tell our kids, don't do this, don't do that. They go out and they mess up. When they come back in, I mean, especially if it's been long and prolonged, like it ought to be like the prodigal's father running down the road to bring them back. Like, I think that's the posture that we would want to have.
All right, next question. Majority culture American Christians have often struggled with too deeply desiring cultural power. How can we help the church see the goodness of living prophetically on the margins?
I don't know that the church, I don't know that it's that there's that you can put it in simple categories of it's good when we're on the margins or it's good when we're in power. I think there are good aspects to being on the margins, and I think there are good aspects to when Christians are in power. I'm not one of these that thinks that the death of cultural Christianity is in every way a good thing. I think it actually leads to a lot of cultural chaos and a lot of things that are not good as well. So it's a trade-off. Remember, we talked in, church being crisis, church being stable. Cultural Christianity is great in a lot of ways because there's a lot of moral norms that lead to the flourishing in human society. Then there's also a lot of easy believism, and there's a lot of just cultural Christianity that's not actual true Christianity. There's there's formalism that's not even real. People are, are just churched for whatever. So there's good and bad. There's also going to be a lot of bad with a society that has, basically chased faithful Christians out of places of power. So I wouldn't want to say just goodness or badness. I think we've got to recognize that there's such a thing as seeking faithfulness, whether we have levers of power or whether we don't. So it's really it's not the question of is it good to be on the margins? It's will we be faithful while we're on the margins? I mean, when you think about the lack of cultural institutional power, for example, that the Black church has had for the majority of its time, since it started when Richard Allen, and walked out in the Northeast back in the 1700s. Like the question that had to be at the forefront of brothers and sisters' minds in the Black church, which was significantly marginalized even from white evangelical spaces or white Christian spaces, was one of faithfulness. It wasn't necessarily that it was good to be there. It was that they had to figure out what faithfulness looks like in that. And so I think that's the way we've got to think about it is, okay, we may wind up being a prophetic and cultural minority. And if we are, then let's look to brothers and sisters in the UK right now, and brothers and sisters in Australia right now, and in other places like Denmark, and in other places where they already are very much in the minority, and also persecuted Christians in parts of the world where it's predominantly Muslim, or it's and take our cues from brothers and sisters around the world that are in those situations. Ajith Fernando, in the last episode of my podcast, Reconstructing Faith, basically says this is just normal Christianity, being on the margins. But for most people, like this is just normal. So it's I don't remember exactly how I said it. He's almost like, welcome, like welcome to the rest of us. This is what it looks like. And there's a little bit of comfort there, just knowing, oh, okay, we don't have to freak out about that. Christians we're to be faithful in suffering, just like we're to be faithful in prosperity.
All right. So often in society and in family relationships, I've encountered situations where expressive individualism leads to requirements that if you fill 99% of, you still get rejected by them because you didn't affirm them all the way. How do we as believers navigate a society more filled with people like this? Do we become more distant, but leave a bridge for them to come back? Should we actively try to show them their folly in conscripting us into their thinking?
Yeah, that's so hard, because I think part of it comes down to the nature of the relationship and how close it is, and what the specifics are for a relationship like that. I for example, if my son is wandering as a college student into like expressive individualism and is using that kind of, it's all or nothing with me, you either take everything I say about myself, or I think, and I'm probably going to go at that differently than I am with someone who's a colleague or an acquaintance. One of the things that I have found helpful in talking with some Christian friends who have sought to befriend people that on the other side of the moral divide on any number of issues, is for the Christian to ask the question, for them to ask the question, do you think that you could get along with me and we could be friends? Because from my side, totally would love to get to know you. The question is on this is where I'm at. I'm a Jesus follower. I've got a traditional view of this. I love all people. I'm called to love my neighbor. From my perspective, I'd love to get to know you more and be your friend. But I mean, are you open-minded enough for that or not? Like, that's the question to ask. And so I've had friends that have flipped it the other way, to where basically the challenge is on, instead of the assumption being that you're the intolerant one, you've got the hand that's out and asking them, hey, are you open to a relationship with someone who's got radically different views than you do? Or is that just me? And then I think that leads to, like, it leads to, it doesn't always lead to friendships, because sometimes it's just still not going to happen. But it at least has that that it at least shows that from your perspective, that door is wide open, and you want relationship and friendship.
All right, and this will be our final question for the night. Do you see a parallel between the disappointment in the scientific age after two world wars and the potential disappointment in a technological age after crash and burn of Western society?
I don't know. Um, I don't know. I'm not the crash and burn is going to be felt in so many different levels, because technology is not just a separate thing anymore. It's so pervasive in all aspects of our lives that I don't know that there's no way for people to, in general, sort of turn on technology, no matter what happens, because like, we'd have to be talking specifics, like what technology are we talking about? It's the same thing with science. And I think we hinted at this in the last couple of weeks with the whole trust the science stuff, that, that science is even taking a beating when it comes to credibility, more than it was even 10, 15 years ago. And yet we have to ask, well, what kind of science, what kind of scientists, what kind of thing? So I think with technology, it's going to be similar to that. There could be very much a turn against, social media use amongst teenagers, for example, and things like we may eventually see that, like we do smoking and other stuff. So it is possible that culturally attitudes can change, but I think it's going to depend on what technologies we're talking about specifically.
Well, that's going to be it for tonight's session. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and it's so good to see everybody's faces. I'm like recognizing people from week to week, and it's kind of cool. I do want to invite people also just to the TGC 23 conference as well. I know I'll be there. Trevin will be there. Love to see some of you guys. We might even try to put together a little informal meetup, but we'll see. Keep your ears peeled to that end. And we'll see you next week. You'll get a recap email from me here tomorrow. And if any of you are having any challenges or technical things, you can either I'll stay on for a couple minutes. You can hit me up in the DMs, or you can email me at kellercenter@tgc.org. Thanks.
Thanks very much.